more savage than we ever thought we would. That's one way of talking about a particular predicament. But see how the way, for instance, see this. This is how Margaret Atwood talks about it. She says, "You fit into me like a hook into an eye. You fit into me like a hook into an eye. A fish hook, an open eye." I can't think of a better way of getting there. That kind of pressure cooker quality. And that's the only way to get there. That's what I meant when I said, if you apply great heat to language, great compression, you can arrive at this kind of distilled image that can be far more effective than a whole paragraph explaining what you want to say. So I think this for me was a huge turning point. Finding that the image was a way of saying much more than I ever thought, much more than I even knew. The image said more than I ever intended to. And I think this was hugely significant in my discovery of why poetry matters. But I cannot end here if I do not also mention another kind of engagement that happened a little later in my life, where I discovered that words had a tremendous enchantment. Words are tremendously magical, but there were other things that also happened in a poem which I wasn't quite prepared for. But we can talk about that maybe after we pause. Shall we just pause for a minute? If there's anything you'd like to say, anything you'd like to share, even just a poem that you'd like to talk about, anything, we can do that now. Would you like to? Oh, there's a question, yeah?
When we talk about poems, like
the conversation that we have just started about poems is, do you mean to say that poems is a way of conversation in few words? And if it is a conversation in few words, like in today's time, I think so, the way poems are written today are very different from what they were written in the past. So if it is a conversation of a few words, then how do we take it ahead from there? Like if poem, as you said, is a kind of conversation of few words. So how do we justify it into this time?
What is your name?
Purnesh.
Purnesh.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good question, really, because I should add this, Purnesh. For me, a poem is not necessarily about a few words, as much as it is about every word earning its place on the page. Every word. So I'm not therefore saying that a poem should be brief. But I'm saying, make sure that not a single word is superfluous. You need to know, if you're writing a poem, why each of those words is there on the page and not any other. Absolutely not any other. So I'm not therefore saying minimalist poetry is the formula for our times. I'm certainly not saying that, because there is no formula. I'm saying, in fact, that every word has to count. And my way of discovering that was through image, metaphor. Metaphor is the moment for me that brought together the abstract and the concrete and made them seem absolutely inseparable. It's a way of making one feel that an idea is not just something happening here in some little sliver of your cerebral cortex. It's like saying this idea is crunchy. I can bite into it. You know, I've just written a book, I just have a book out here, an anthology called Eating God. It's not my image. It comes from Nammalvar, a 6th century Vaishnava poet. And for me, in a poem like that, God comes alive it's a sacred poem's, devotional verse, but that relationship with God is unforgettable for me. simply because the poet brings it alive in this kind of visceral, sensuous way. It's no longer about sitting and worshipping God. It's not saying, come on, let's all sit around and do our prayers. It's not saying that. It's saying, come, let's eat God. I'll never forget that. I will never forget that. And that's the reason I think many of us are drawn to so many of these mystic poets. Because they're talking to you about making love to God. They're talking to you about eating God. And it's not just sensationalism. There's a deep part of the self that recognizes the truth of this moment. The very deep lust that fuels an image like that. And I think that's what for me poetry is, recognizing the intelligence of the image. An intelligence much deeper than my own.
How do you know when a poem is right?
When you're ready to, say, hey, this is the final piece, because you have talked about metaphor, you've also talked about the words dancing, and you obviously hear the sound of the poetry and see its musical quality before bringing it out. And there's so much of music in your poetry that just springs out when I've read a few words. But how do you know when it's right? And how many of you here write poems? Yes, that's awesome. 2? Okay, only 2, 3, 4. Was that you? Did you say yes? Yes. And who has never written a poem? Why do I find that difficult to believe? Huh? It's a bit difficult to pass the age of 16 without having written a poem. Really? You've not written a love poem? Ever? That's all. Okay, I doubt that somehow, because almost everyone has to write a love poem. It has happened to everyone. Yeah? And there is something about the voltage of love at 16 that demands that transcription of the page. Yes, in blood. Absolutely in blood.
In blue blood.
It's a tricky question really, to know when something that is just a page in your journal can turn into a poem. It's a tricky one, because we've all shared love poems with those we care for, and or sometimes with a friend, and we were deeply affronted when the friend looked polite, but very nice, and then change the subject, which most friends do when you share poems. That's one thing to discover very soon. That's one of the reasons poets die early. There's nothing as demoralizing as people smiling politely and saying very nice. Now, what about tomorrow? Is our meeting on? There are many, many ways in which people change the subject. So you get used to that quite early. This is not my line, but it's a line from a well-known poet who tells us that a poem is never completed. You know that. It's only abandoned. And there is a truth to that, which every writer, I think, knows, that you never finish your poem. You say, okay, I made my piece, or I just give up, now I'll write another poem. For a long time, you endlessly tweak and prune and wrestle with this particular poem, and then you just give up and say, okay, you have to make your peace with that defeat. And then you write another one. It's really like that. It's really like that. I think the way that works for me, and if I were to just share this on the level of process, I would say that I write something at a particular moment, and if I feel it sort of holds together, I would put it away for at least 6 months, or at least 1 month. But it's important for me to not think about it at all, so that I've forgotten about it entirely. And when I've forgotten, and then open that drawer and pull it out, that reading is very important. And on that reading, I have a sense of what in that poem is significant and what can just be weeded out entirely. Yeah.
So I was in school when you can you hear me? In school when we were taught poetry, often there was an assumption that poetry and beauty and beauty understood in a certain kind of way, sort of go hand in hand. But I remember, so one read Shelley and you went through all the roads and all that stuff. It was nice. And then I remember for me though, when a poem really worked was when I read Ramanujan's River. And I think it's called. And it was short, it was totally different. It was harsh, very balanced. And I'm asking questions about beauty and poetry, and this is a big question. So let's talk.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Can you hear?
So I'm asking.
Please ask the
Have the mic.
question.
So when we went to school and got taught poetry, and you go to an English medium school, you're learning, Shelley and all these people, and reading a lot of poems, and young Locke and people like that. But there's an assumption about poetry and beauty. But I remember for me when a poem first worked as a reader, when it hit me, the same way as you say you knew you were in front of a poem that I did, right? Was when I read Ramanujan's I think it's called A River, right? It's a very short poem. It's very barren. It's not beautiful like any of the odes are beautiful at all. It's almost opposite. But somehow that poem really hit. It just made sense. I could see it. And so the question I'm asking is, but it made me question. I'm looking back and asking questions about beauty. What is beauty in poetry? Because if you ask me, is that a beautiful poem, I would say yes, it is. And yet there's so much violence and, so just...
It's not an incoherent question at all. It's not a groping question. Because I think this is amazing whenever one does poetry workshops with people. It's amazing how many young people have this notion of what cannot be a poem because it's not poetic. So there is a notion that somehow to poeticize language, we have to write in a particular way. One is to invert. So I will not say I have done this, I will say this I have done, and then I have a poem. That's one assumption. The other assumption is, of course, rhyme. Yeah? Inversion and rhyme. So you sound just a little archaic, then you feel, I must be in the realm of poetry. So these are notions, and I completely understand where they're coming from. It has to do with the way in which, again, the way in which we negotiate poetry, I think, in schools a lot. Apart from some wonderful teachers who reminded us that there were other ways to do it. I have to at this point stop. I cannot keep talking about school without talking about the teacher who was the exception. Please pause and give a wonderful round of applause. Anita Delutra, one of the most gifted teachers, I think, of all time. Certainly in the city, she's been one of the most significant and has molded generations of students in remarkable ways. But I think so often, we began to believe that we had to use a particular language in a particular way to consider ourselves poets. Also that we should be writing about sunsets a little more than we should write about eclipses. Okay, you could write about eclipses also, but much more sunsets than we should say write about the puddle on the road that we saw yesterday, or
dirty souls.
Dirty souls, yeah, or just grubby old shoes, We should be writing about flowers and beautiful things. So I think that's where it's coming from, isn't it? And I think the reason why that poem stayed with you is because it wasn't doing any of those things. It took me time also, though, to realize that when you read some of the most celebrated poets, many, many centuries ago, they were also dealing with the notion of cliché in their own ways. So for instance, a beautiful woman, a typical Anglo-Saxon beauty, one would imagine, would have golden hair, blue eyes, would walk a few feet above the ground. That kind of delicate, beautiful subject of the Petrarchan sonnet, basically. But you realize, here's a poet, Shakespeare, who already is anticipating that when he comes up with a sonnet that starts with the line, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun." Nothing like the sun. That shock moment stays with me even today. Nothing like the sun, then who is this woman? right? And he ends with, and he says, my mistress when she walks, treads on the ground. Yeah, so he's dealing with what we regard as the legacy of Archie's greeting card verse, which we think is a contemporary legacy. He's dealing with its equivalent then. Yeah? Cliches as old as the hills, we haven't discovered it in the 20th century or the 21st. Everyone had to deal with it. There's that other lovely John Donne poem, which starts with the line, "For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love." Now that kind of robust, colloquial, conversational starting point can only come from someone who's thought these matters through very, very deeply. Yeah? I can't forget that line, not because it was dinned into me by English teachers, but simply because it's such an arresting opening line for a poem, and it takes you right there to a moment of intimacy. You're not standing apart. You can't. You're eavesdropping on the most intimate conversation happening between two people. So I think poetry, when it works, forever and forever, has always extended, challenged, punctured expectation. A working poem always does that. Unfortunately, the way in which many of us learned the romantics that you talk about, we began to believe this was the way in which a poem ought to be written, and that was it. It's a formula. Often forgetting that the romantic poets were doing very, very unexpected things with form themselves. Very unexpected things. So they were in fact responding to 18th century neoclassical verse and so on, which we don't need to get in here, but clearly they were all grappling with convention and not allowing us to settle for stale language. Because if there's one thing poetry is not, in fact, if there's any formula for poetry, that's perhaps it. Poetry is not ready-made language. It's not language you can borrow from ideology. It's not language you can borrow from scripture, philosophy. You have to find this language that comes from this really hot, spluttering place inside you. And when someone hears that, they know they're in the presence of it. Yeah.
To connect to what Samir was asking again about beauty, I was at a talk the other day by a painter in Delhi, and he actually talked about, it was actually a talk for a lot of children about child's rights. Child's rights. And he actually tried to propose that perhaps a right for every child and every adult as well to be a right to beauty.
I agree.
And he tried to define it in a way that perhaps if you go back to our ancient architects in India or even in the Renaissance or before, that there were these four elements that were harmony, rhythm, proportion and balance. And if that were within the framework, you achieved beauty. So it didn't, of course, sunsets and things were not necessary, but is that, so what is your view on beauty?
Very good question. It's a wonderful question, really, because is beauty important in poetry? To me, beauty is hugely important in our lives. And art, for me, that's what it is about. It's a moment that makes you feel that beauty and truth can coexist, they can come together. I think that's what a poem is for me. A verbal utterance that brings together beauty and truth. But that does not mean recycling well-worn notions of what constitutes the beautiful, but finding beauty in all kinds of in unexpected places, and awakening you to beauty where you never thought it existed. And also, you could be describing, let's say, love. Lorca. Love is like a pair of old shoes. Is that beautiful? To my mind it is. It's a beautiful image simply because it takes you right there to that moment. It cuts so close to the bone, you know it. That's beauty too. The perfect, what he's talking about when he talks about proportion and harmony and principle and so on is really classical notions of what constitutes the beautiful, and I think there is a kind of classicism here. Pope called it the right word in the right place. That is what it is, isn't it? The sense that nothing but this. My love is like a pair of old shoes. Nothing but that will suffice. That to me is a moment of beauty, of illumination, of clarity, of insight. And it's beautiful. Yes.
The fish hook, that is an image that you cannot get out of your mind. It is not beautiful, it is a bit horrific really, but it is perfect. It is the perfect.
This the gentleman behind you.
Thank you so much for today's session, ma'am. I attended a couple of these sessions before, and I thank you so much for making poetry so beautiful for me. And it was a question that was always in my mind. If you had a child, ma'am, and based on your experience, if you had to introduce this child to poetry today, in today's context, what would you do differently? And I say this because growing up, I didn't have too many people who would read books around me. So I came to poetry from non-fiction and prose. And when I started reading poetry, I found this tendency in myself to over-intellectualize what I was reading. And for a long time, I thought I would never figure this out. But recently, I was reading Milton's Office Blindness, and then I started reading a little bit about where he was coming from when he wrote that poem. And then I realized that maybe I don't have to get something out of this. And when I stayed with every word, I realized where he was coming from, that you don't have to really take something out of this, but maybe he's just trying to express a particular point of time. So how can we get little kids to get to understand that aspect of poetry? Because it took me like years of just being with a book and a poem to get to that point.
That's a good question. What is your name? Abhishek. Yeah, it's such a good question, and I really cannot answer that completely honestly, because I don't know what it's like to go day in and day out and be with kids. I don't know. But this I can say, my hunch is this. Any kind of learning that I've done in my life, and poetry is part of it, but any learning that has made sense to me, has happened for me just by hanging around, just by marinating in something. It's not come to me because I was told to come back and repeat it 10 times over, though there is a certain pleasure in repetition. I don't want to take that away. There is a pleasure in saying things out loud and saying things again. But just being around something, and to know that there are ways in which osmotically almost you pick things up, that there is a value to that. That at the end of half an hour, it's not time is up, now go away and learn algebra instead. That is what I detested about school, I must say. Just to know that it's all right, you hang around this poem, it may speak to you today, it may not, but there's a hunch. There's a hunch that there's something there. It's all right to trust that hunch. It's all right to talk about something that you don't quite understand, and to say, I don't understand, but I want to be around this person. I don't know why, but I just want to be there. It's okay to trust that hunch. There is a deep intelligence in that hunch. And I think it can be a very empowering hunch when it comes to art. Because it's not about understanding and decoding and intellectualizing, as you were saying. It's really about just a niggling sense that I must be here. But I cannot resist. I actually wrote this down. It's an old poem from my very first book, which it is the right time to read, given your question. May I read it? Okay. It's my rage poem about my school days. I have grown up tormented about school and always plotting my vendetta. And I thought vendetta would mean going like a night and sitting in the staff room and not having to deal with the next period where the rest of us had to write whatever compositions or whatever we had to do while she went off and presumably ate sandwiches in the staff room. Did you? No? For a long time I thought I would just become a teacher. That would be my revenge. But then it seemed like a very long and tiresome thing to have to do. So I decided to just write a rant poem instead. Sorry, you wanted to ask something?
I'll talk after you're done.
Okay. Just a quick rant and then we'll be done. Advice to a 4-year-old on her first day of school. The only reference here that I will mention is the grammar text that some of us studied in school. I don't know if you still do. Wren and Martin? Yes. Oh. Advice to a 4-year-old on her first day at school. This is the sacred litany. 1. Right-hand margins, pin-drop silences, pattern writing without ruptures of the joineries, sharpened HB pencils, double finger spaces, fingers on lips. 2. Pink and white girls who can play fairies and end-of-term plays, symmetrical girls who don't stick out at odd angles in the march past, geometrical girls always equipped with compass boxes, cultivated girls with dictions manicured by militant horticulturists, streamlined girls who don't run into awkward lengths and 4-line report cards, ornithological girls who prefer wrens and martins to daydreaming, respectable girls who prefer daffodils to Venus flytraps, down-to-earth girls who know that boys are extraterrestrial, dumb girls who believe that Pavlov's dog will have his day. Now repeat. It's also an example of a poem that started out as rage and ended somewhere else, you know. It takes the sting out of it for me at least. It's in my very first book. Did I answer your question? I did.
Showing interest in literature or poetry, we send them towards classic first. And he talked about parents not being a reader or not being interested in books, but for children whose parents are interested in literature, they tell you to, go towards the classic literature first, and if you don't understand it, then you should not be reading it in the first place. You are in the wrong business and you should not be here. And if the same child grows up and starts liking modern literature more than the classic, then it's considered like they are some kind of pseudo literary readers or something. So I wanted to ask you, what are, how to keep the interest going on in those kids, because once the demoralization is not just when your friends do not like your poem or change the subject. It comes early on when you are told that the poem you are liking right now is not actually a poem at all.
Didn't he? I don't have to. Do you remember the poem? Do you know the poem I mean? They fuck you up your mom and dad. But
not just parents, even the teachers, when the initial teachers, when anybody.
I suspect this is perhaps what we could do. The reason I mentioned Shakespeare particularly in response to what she said is because I think sometimes we grow up railing against the canon because they made our lives so difficult when we were growing up. It felt like, you don't like Shakespeare, there's something wrong with you. You don't like Tennyson, something wrong with you. Rather than finding, and I think perhaps this is what I would try to do as a parent if I was one, or with a child if I had one, to try and find strands that can in fact draw your attention to why something works, even in the canon. That's why I mentioned the Shakespeare poem. I'm very grateful for having studied the canon. I don't have a problem with it. But I would like to make room in my life and in the lives of other people that I know for other voices too. But as long as I'm given the critical apparatus to question everything, the canon as well as stuff that I think needs to be in the canon, I'm all right with it. So that would be my response to that. But I must say, I went through many years of rage. So the school poem was one, but I also wrote a poem which I don't have here, but it was the title poem of my first book, which was called On Cleaning Bookshelves. And the whole point of that poem was to set up conversations between writers whom I thought ought to meet each other. And have a cup of coffee, maybe drink a glass of wine together. But these were right. I wanted to set up conversations between high art and low art. I wanted Milton to meet Krishnamurti, or I wanted Sappho to meet Mirabai, or whatever. I wanted license to hang around the people I wanted to hang around. You know, so it was a long journey. It didn't happen easily, and there was a lot of anger and pain. There is the pain of exclusion that I think many of us experience. One is just the exclusion not being taken seriously when you write. The other is the exclusion of not having your opinion heard. I do believe that many young women face this in a particular way. Others do too. But I do know that it takes a long time to believe that your voice counts. And I think I went through many long years of laryngitis, you know, just not knowing that, just racked with self-doubt. I just couldn't write, and I found it difficult to read as well. Because everyone had opinions on everything. I still find that a bit difficult, you know. That there doesn't seem to be room for just groping, floundering questions and conversations. It's all about definitive full stops. I like this. Did you see yesterday's film? Did you like it? I hated it. And it ends there. There doesn't seem to be room for question marks, for hyphens, for dashes, for commas. Poetry for me is really the art of the comma. It took me time to figure that out. And that actually brings me to that fifth point that I left unmentioned. There are many ways in which I talk about what happened in 97, March 1997 to me. I'm not going into major biography at this point, but I do want to say this. One of the ways I talk about that experience is this. One day I felt I had just fallen headlong into one of those blank spaces on a page of poetry. That's how it seemed to me. It was a place of such terrifying emptiness. It was a place where no language could enter. And I think that's when I realized that there is a lot more happening in a poem than words. That's when I realized I wasn't just this grand manipulator of language, which is the way I liked to think of myself as a practicing poet. That the whole challenge now was to trust a poem to lead me, rather than being in a hurry to impose my agenda on it, simply because I realized that if the image, if metaphor is intelligent, I had never been prepared for the fact that the silences in a poem are one hell of a lot more intelligent than I could ever hope to be. So I think I realized today that poetry matters because it is a verbal art that embraces pauses like none other. Fiction doesn't do this quite the same way. Fiction takes you along on a certain, there's a horizontal tug, right, a narrative that takes you from one moment to another. It's very comforting on that level, which is the reason we all pick up novels to read on flights. How many of us have picked up a book of poems and taken them, a book of verse along with us? Poems are uncomfortable. They're not comfortable places to be. And one of the reasons they're not comfortable is because they're ridden with gaps. Ridden with gaps. And that's part of their strength. That's where a poem gets its life energy from its gaps. You cannot be a poet without tripping into and falling headlong into one of those gaps at some point in your life, which is yet another reason not to take on poetry. Don't read it, don't practice it. If you want to lead a tame life, poetry is not for you. It's a dangerous thing to do.
So do you mean to say that poetry is not for the weak-hearted, faint-hearted?
Definitely not for the faint-hearted. Definitely not. Definitely.
It requires a lot of courage, energy, time.
Yeah. And it's I started by talking about it as a substance, a chemical, but it's not a laboratory experiment that you can conduct safely out there with your gloves on. You can't. It's explosive stuff. You have to implicate yourself, as I think you do in many other art forms, but this is a dangerous one. More dangerous, I believe, than other verbal arts.
I think poetry itself doesn't follow a formula. And that is the reason why it is not a very safe chemical to experiment.
It doesn't follow, it's true. Most arts don't, but I really do think there is none that, you know, those blank spaces on a page of poetry are just not a matter of convention. They mean. They may not mean something, but they mean. And it takes so long to figure that out.
I get a sense that it's a spiritual side to you.
So I'd like to know what has triggered you into that, or it's just another probing question. So I just want to know what.
Did you hear that? Did you hear it? Yeah. One on the, sorry, what is your name?
I'm Madhumita.
I think on the level of content, Madhumita, that's certainly true if I were to just answer it on that level. You know, that there was a fascination with philosophy or with mysticism. That's a part of my life. And therefore I have done various things like edit this particular book of Bhakti poetry, or written a book on the Buddha, or done a biography of Sadhguru, contemporary mystic, or edited an anthology of pilgrimages, sacred journeys. So that's on the level of content, if I were to answer your question purely on that level. But another way to answer that question would be precisely in terms of what I said just now, which is discovering what those silences can mean, and discovering how uncomfortable those spaces are, and then realizing that I had to make my peace with those silences in some way, because they seemed more real than anything I had known. So, sometime after 97, certain questions took on an urgency, and it didn't always mean that I was writing about different things, though some of that is borne out by the books that I've done. It sometimes just meant staying away from language for a while, but also learning to write. It was about writing differently. If I look at my first book of poems and I look at the most recent, I can see the shift. And the shift has happened in terms of form. I feel the language is more perforated. It's more porous. And that wouldn't have happened to me if I hadn't understood something about pauses. Yes.
So it's also, you know, how others discover themselves. Because you said the city where I live and the city where I belong. I just realized, you know, that I've been analyzing that about the city myself, but to put it into words. That was something really amazing, because Bombay does that to you. You know, at times you get so hassled, and at the same time you go somewhere, you want to come back.
Yes.
I just wrote a small poem for you.
Right now?
Hearing all this.
You wrote it now?
Yeah. Can I just read it to you and share it with everyone? A deeply talented lady named Arundhathi, with a love, depth and caring she brings to poetry, has assured us all that poetry and poets shall stand tall from now and forevermore on this path of self-discovery of one's own and the inner self of others. May Arundhati be blessed 100-fold, for truly today, for each one of us, she has unearthed a treasure beyond gold. Thank you so much.
Sorry, yes.
Self-expression and discovery. So each poet tends to write things that they personally feel or that is happening around them or in their personal life. Is it a scary thought that when you are thinking that this poem is about to be published, and you know, a lot of people will be reading this poem and judging the life of the person who is reading this? Do you sometimes dilute those words or the meaning behind it just so that so the people, you know, the people who are reading, keeping in mind the people who are going to read it?
like making a movie and putting your life out there. But this I will say, that even if I wanted to, and even if you wanted to, sit and write a page in your journal on a daily basis, and even if you wanted to splatter yourself across a page and transcribe every ripple in your stream of consciousness on that page, you would find that memory itself fictionalizes. Memory itself edits for you. So it's really not as straightforward, as naked an experience as we might like to believe. So even in that act, you're not just a stenographer. Something more is happening. There's composition. You are composing yourself even in your diary. Poetry is in fact conscious composition. So it is about truth insofar as I'm inviting a reader to share this moment in my inner life. So in that sense, I would like to believe it is a moment of truth. But it is not necessarily about my biography. So for instance, I have poems to my grandmother, I have a poem to my sister. I'm not sure they would recognize themselves in those poems. But in terms of an inner truth, in terms of the inner life of my own inner life, I believe there is a truth in that. Do you know what I'm saying? So, does one censor? We all do, sometimes even not being aware of it. And other times we may consciously say, I'm going to chop off this word and put in something else, simply because I want to have a word that will mean something to her and something else for you. I want that multivalence. I don't want the word to mean the same thing for everyone. So I would deliberately choose a word that has that resonance. Because eventually that's all a poem is doing. I realize this more and more. You're just trying to write a line and you want to let it out there and allow it to pulsate a bit. That's all it is. It's like a tuning fork. You're just letting it out there, wanting you to throb a little in the universe. That's all you're doing.
I think we're out of time. Yeah, okay, sure.
Since you just started with the city, I had written something. So, no, it is just 2 lines. I feel so, because from whatever you have said, since I travel a lot, so the title is Another Day. It is not a poem, it's just an observation. Just like all of us, she too belongs to and lives in this maximum city. The Mumbai, a much proclaimed rosebed of dreams, a busy city of pimped ideas, a fast metro of controversial disbelief, is a livelihood. The bottom of a flyover is actually her premium rooftop, probably 30 to 40 feet above. She has to adjust her position of mobile shelter based on the movement of sun, manipulation of cops, and mercy of citizens who walk past her. She boils rice for breakfast, breastfeeds her 3 toddlers, bathes in the open, relieves in the open. The mornings are routine. Post-noon, she begs, sells, borrows, and disposes. During evenings, she cooks the dinner, tends to her drunk husband, and puts her kids to sleep. And then when the city slows down, she decorates herself with flashy colors to stand waving at cars of rich men, spoiled brats, drunk drivers. At times, she gets picked up, at times gets physically abused, emotionally assaulted, and returns feeling torn socially. The roads grow lonely, dogs come sniffing, and her husband slowly abandons her. She wakes up, she prays, she relieves, she cooks. Happiness for her is not a Friday or a Saturday. For her in this city of invisibility, it is just another day.
Thank you.
And let me also say, thank you both for your poems. And one thing I do say at workshops, which I just want to leave you with, that is, I know we've all written poems at some point, and we will continue to. And the whole idea of this session was really to make us all feel empowered to go out there and write. But can I also suggest one thing, that you cannot really be a writer of poetry if you don't read poetry. So just ask yourself, in this past year, how many books of poems you've bought. If your answer is in single digits, there's hope for you. But for most people, the answer to that is none at all. Try and rectify that. You have 3 weeks to go. Arundhathi, as I say thank you for this wonderful session, I have to share with the audience what I told you over the phone yesterday, which is, for me personally, my engagement with poetry ended in school, but after the Peshawar attacks 4 days back, I was struggling with myself on how to come to terms with it. And, you know, as an aside, I was just reading your poetry to prepare for this session and to see where it could go. And I just chanced upon your poem Confession, and it actually drove me to tears. And I don't want to say much else, but thank you. But I would request that you leave us with a reading of that, if that's okay. Thank you, Lovely. It's an interesting choice of poem. It is for me the most important poem in some ways the most important poem in my last book. It took me a very long time to write a poem that I could call Confession, simply because there's such an heritage of belief about confessional poetry of a particular kind. It took me a long time to be able to write this. It has an epigraph by a Jungian psychoanalyst and shaman called Thomas More, who says, to take a homeopathic approach to the soul is to deal with the darkness in ways that are in tune with the dark. Confession. It's taken time to realize that no one survives, not even the ordinary. Time to own up then, to blue throat and gallbladder extraordinaire, to rages pristine, to guilt unsmeared by mediocrity, to separation traumas subcontinental, to griefs that dare to be primordial. Time to iron out a face corrugated with perennial hope. Time to shrug off the harlotry and admit there's nothing hygienic about this darkness. No potted palms, no elevator music. I erupt from pillars, half lion, half woman. The floor space index I demand is nothing short of epic. I still wait sometimes for the flicker of revelation, but for the most part, I'm unbribable. When I open the coffee percolator, the roof flies off. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for being here, really.